Hello everyone, welcome to Tortoise's weekly open news meeting. A thinking where we try to map the journalism that we are planning to do, that we should be doing over the course of the next weeks and months, but also try to make sense of what we're seeing at the moment and whether there are either leads or ideas there that we should follow up. I'm James Harding, I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. Welcome. My colleague, the mighty Liz Mosley. I have had a new haircut, thank you for that. My niece's dog clippers did this work. I think I'll be safe till Christmas. Sorry, that was a private message from Mehdi actually, but just to let you know, yes, I have had a new haircut. Liz is corralling the chat, please do weigh in. Oh no, Basha is, forgive me, there's Basha, hello everyone. I tell you what we wanted to do today, if we can, is just try to fill in some of the blanks on the story that we've been working on this week, which we've given the kicker, the government is unwell. And it's an attempt to try to understand why the UK has been singled out for particular punishment, both in the number of deaths and in the economic damage that COVID-19 is doing to the UK by comparison with other countries. As you may have seen, I wrote a piece called Britain's Disease, that's in the Tortoise app and ran yesterday. My colleague, Matt Dancona, has done what I think is quite an exceptional thing, which is to try and follow the story of what happened from the moment that Boris Johnson told us that he had mild symptoms of the disease, all the way through to that public announcement on May the 10th, and compare what government ministers were saying with what was going on behind the scenes. Someone once told me the real job of journalism is to map the gap between the official reality and the real reality. I don't make a claim to say that we've done that whole thing, but we've certainly made a start at it. So please do listen to Matt's piece. Again, it's in the app and it's going to be more widely available. I think it's really an exceptionally revealing piece of work. But back when I was at the Times, and Dave Taylor, my colleague, was at the Times with me, we used to open meetings like this by turning to a fellow editor, or I would, and saying, what have you got? What are the things that we think we should be covering? And as you've seen, thanks, actually, this was Basha's innovation, thanks to Basha a few weeks ago, we've started doing effectively an open news list, a weekly look at, here are the subjects and stories we don't think are necessarily getting attention, or we don't fully understand, or we feel poised to mouth off about, to have an opinion on, but we want to see if we can round those opinions out to get more information on them. So with that in mind, Dave, can I just turn to you first and just talk us through the news list in answer to the question, what have we got? What have we got?
Yes, well, my memory of it is that it's usually an exercise in tap dancing where you think, what have we got? But the good news is there's quite a few things on our news list today. We talked about, we want to talk about, let's say, half a dozen things. Unemployment figures out today. You might think at first glance that they're not bad news because the unemployment headline rate has not gone up particularly, but we can see that there are a couple of markers there of the way forward, and we're heading for a cliff edge, we think, in October when companies have properly pulled back from furlough and there really isn't a great deal of support anymore. And I think what I was asking myself is if we are in store for a period of mass unemployment, 1 in 10 unemployed, what does that look like? And it might be instructive for us to go back to the recessions of 1981 and 91 and 2008 to see what clues there are about what it's like socially and culturally to live in that moment. The thing that I'm not clever enough to know, but I know a man in Chris Cook who undoubtedly is what happens if you see a simultaneous kind of jobs collapse right across every sector, construction, manufacturing, transportation, retail, finance. I don't know whether we've been there before to such a profound effect. So I'm interested in that. I think when it comes to our sort of our big sort of belonging identity sort of area, we're interested in island races and New Zealand. I know we've talked about before. We all think they have been admirable in their strict and early pandemic handling. It took 2 Brits to go there to breach that, it seems. But the question for us, I think, is is it going to be extreme isolation, the price you have to pay to be a nation that kind of keeps this out of its territory? And then, closer to home in the UK, now that we know there isn't going to be an extension of the Brexit transition period beyond the end of this year, I want to know, did anyone in government in the UK actually assess the impact of ploughing on?
Yeah.
What's the cost of that, the on cost on top of what we're all going through? And then I thought I'm particularly drawn to David Lammy pulling Boris Johnson down over that piece he wrote at the weekend. Johnson was saying it's time for a cross-governmental commission to look at all aspects of inequality. This was his response to Black Lives Matter. And David Lammy, who actually did run an independent review that David Cameron asked him to do in 2017, came out beautifully, I thought, on Monday and said, I made 35 recommendations. Why don't you implement them? And while you're at it, there's another 110 from a review into deaths in police custody. And there are 26 more on workplace discrimination. And there are 30 on Windrush. So it's 201 in total. I think there's a job for Tortoise to do an audit of those. And thank you to David Lammy for tipping us off. Marcus Rashford, I think, is inspirational in what he's just done. The government seems to be trying to say we're not going to allow school meals to go through the summer, but I do think that it points us really to another area we've been concerned about, which is how do we reckon with the impact on children of COVID-19 and lockdown? And you can come at that from so many different angles. And then finally, a couple of things. I think we were interested in the Duterte crackdown on fake news in the Maria Ressa case and Rappler in the Philippines. We know that Trump has been the global driving force on trying to discredit the media. How do we do more on the targeting of journalists around the world? And then lastly, the BP write down to the tune of about £14 billion or $17 billion, their oil and gas assets. And, the optimistic Tortoise view on that would be the dash to net zero is on. And so what does that look like? And we're already doing some journalism there. So I hope it's going to come to fruition. So there's a few things there to think about.
That's brilliant. I think that let's talk about those. I mean, the list, just to be clear: unemployment, New Zealand, Brexit, David Lammy and recommendations getting kicked into the long grass, the toll on children, the Philippines, Maria Ressa, Rappler, and essentially the use of COVID-19 to press the suppression of journalism, and the oil price, the value of energy assets, and the right time. Okay, Dave, it's a great list. We won't get through all of it, but it gives us a starting point.
Yeah.
I think that, by the way, it looks as though the Marcus Rashford U-turn has happened faster than we thought. We thought it would be sort of late afternoon.
Good. I saw that Nick Watt on Newsnight was kind of predicting that, wasn't he? That they'd said no, but the pressure's going to come. And
I had this moment, Dave, this morning when I was listening to Martha currently interviewing Grant Shapps. I think it was Martha, but there was this wonderful moment where you could hear him grinding through this, and I really wanted Martha Carney to say, "Mr. Shapps, what does it feel like when you know the position's not going to hold? You still got to do the 8:10 interview. it must feel awful. Can you just explain to us what that feeling's like? But for whatever reason, she didn't ask it and he ploughed on. Chris, can I come to you if that's all right? I wondered whether or not we could just do two things with you. Hello. One is, on the unemployment, there are a number of points in the chat about how we count the unemployed. I'm also interested to know what you think, because I think there's something of a sigh of relief around this 600,000 number, in that it's not as bad as they feared. But I wonder whether or not the furlough scheme just continues to disguise the scale of the unemployment we're in for. And so, if anything, there's a risk this number gives us false comfort. So I just wondered, can we just talk a little about unemployment and what your read on that is first? And then we'll come to some of the other things, Brexit and others, in a moment.
Sure. So I think the starting place is to go back to last week's data, which showed a 20% decline in output. And it's not really, if you think employment is kind of a function of output and the number of people you need to make the output, and you can't have a 20% decline and be relaxed about employment and wages, basically. Anything that suggests this isn't a potential disaster unfolding is wrong. The 600,000 number is effectively the number of people on payrolls. So there are a lot of people who have been, where firms have basically done, I think, they've done a decent thing, and they basically said, you know what, we might have to make you redundant in 3 or 4 months' time, but why don't we just pay you what we can get from the government for the next few months, and we'll top you up a bit. And so, there's a sort of bit of evergreening on employment roles going on. There's also a really big problem with the fact that because we've changed the eligibility criteria for for some of the benefits during this period, it's actually we can't use those numbers. Normally we might say, well, we're worried about what's called the LFS measure, which is a survey, right? It's a huge, the way we measure unemployment properly is we take a survey asking, are you in work? Would you like work in the next 6 weeks if you could get it? And if your answer is, I'm not in work, but I'd like it, you're unemployed. We could use something called claimant count, which is literally how many people are getting unemployment benefits. But because we've changed the criteria, that's an unstable measure now. But I think, to come back to the first point I made, the big thing is, with a decline in output of this size, it's not possible to be sanguine about employment or wages.
And Chris, one of the questions I've got is, and I was really interested in the parliamentary report into the British Airways announcement, but around the 12,000 redundancies. We've come to the end, although I see that Sam Houston's made this point, there's a weird disconnect between markets and real economy forecasts. But one thing you can say is we've actually had quite a long bull run in the markets. And those periods of time where the markets keep rising, often, if you like, calcify some of the habits that are happening in big businesses. And so they don't necessarily make the changes they've wanted to make because things are running smoothly along. And I wonder the extent to which big companies are now choosing to make large redundancies, some of which they probably would have or needed to make, that are not COVID related. And I wonder how much you think what we're about to see is something not just emergency driven, but is structural or even cyclical, sorry is the word I'm looking for. How can we predict that or read that?
So I think there's a question around every recession about structural realignment of the economy, right? So during the 80s and 90s, there were downturns, during which point basically surplus capacity in manufacturing and like primary industry was shaken out. So people lost their jobs in the coal mines, and we knew the coal mines weren't coming back, right? And one of the sort of central questions one of the things about Britain is we've always kind of let that stuff rip. Since the period, we've kind of stood aside and let those forces run through the economy, which is very different to some other countries. So Germany in particular has always run employment support schemes through recessions. So the idea is, if you're a very highly skilled BMW mechanic, they want BMW to be making cars in 5 or 10 years' time. So they'll basically subsidize BMW to keep you in work and keep you attached to BMW and keep you, useful in that regard for any future rebound. We've always taken the bet basically that we'll rebound faster than Germany, because Germany is calcified into this model. Mm-hmm. But I also think it's probably why they've got higher productivity as well. Like it's not clear we've made the right bet over letting things rip and then moving on again.
I mean, the reason I raise it with you, although I was going to say it's not a super geeky point, it's obviously a super geeky point, but there is the significance of it, presumably, is one, it will have an impact on the depth of the recession, how long it lasts and how deep it runs. If business have been hoarding, to use the sort of economist phrase, have been hoarding labour, they've had more workers than they've needed and they need to make structural changes, presumably in certain places, certain industries, it will have a longer and deeper effect. And depending on your point of view on this, it will also have an impact on the extent to which the UK motors out of this recession and what kind of economy comes out of it. So
yeah,
it's quite a profound, the unemployment numbers are not just a kind of personal crisis for millions of people, they're also potentially a structural, change for the UK.
Yeah, and so I mean, there are lots of critiques you can make of the British sort of business model over the last 30, 40 years, and one of them I think is that we've taken this view that devil take the hindmost basically in recession. Yeah. You don't bail people out. One of the curiosities has always been that we've had such terrible technical education at the same time. So we're very, very bad at upskilling people who need new jobs. So we've never really invested in further education. We're letting it die again at the moment. It's been, it's had a really terrible 10 years. All of the things you would think you would need to do to facilitate, if you like, a sort of the nimble economy, we're actually, lots of it we're just quite bad at, and further education is really cheap. You could for the cost of a few Marcus Rashfords, you could revolutionize it.
So, Chris, I can see people talking. I want to bring some people in on the economy and particularly on consumption. So I'm going to do that if I might, and then come back to Brexit. And it looks, Dave, as though we should have a proper discussion about, David Lammy and the kind of institutional grinding of gears in government. But I wondered, actually, Sam Houston, I want to see if I could to bring Sam in, and I hope, Addy, I'm not going to get you, it's either Aid or Addy, I don't know, but I'd love to bring you in too. There's Sam. Are you there? There you are, Sam.
Hi,
yes.
Hey, how are you doing? Yeah.
I just interested, we talked about this fun enough this morning, this markets point. What's your read on that?
I just having been watching the markets, it was odd. I mean, didn't they recover? People know better than me, but they recovered nearly all of the losses, didn't they? That happened in February. And so that was already just to note that kind of disconnect, because there's a lot of uncertainty still about. Our furlough scheme goes on till October, so it might be fair to say that we won't really know what the full impact on the jobs market will be till the end of October. Although I do think it's better since July. I mean, from July, they'll be able to be flexible about it and let people back to work, for example, 2 or 3 days a week, and have the government pay the rest. I think that's a good step forward.
Although my expectation, Sam, is that also at that same time, companies are being asked to contribute more. So the sort of moment where the music stopped and the government said freeze ends, I think. I think we won't see it just fall off in October. I think we'll see it fall off at the end of June, end of July, end of August. It'll keep.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, because they didn't have that flexibility before, did they? The furlough scheme was kind of an on-off thing. So people were either sent home and not allowed to work, or so I think that a lot of firms just kind of took that opportunity in what was an emergency with a lot of uncertainty. So I hope that flexibility will be helpful. For example, my wife's been furloughed, and we're hoping that she'll be able to go back for 2 or 3 days a week, leading up to full-time employment by the end of October, hopefully.
Okay, well, Sam, I certainly hope so. And I just want to put that to Chris. I'd also love to see if I can bring in John Alexander, who's made some points about consumerism and the economy to come. But can I just ask you, Chris, when I look at the market numbers and the real economy forecasts, I have to say that my heart really sinks, not just because, they seem so out of whack, but particularly because if I understand the explanations being given by people in the markets, it's that when the government is putting so much more money so much more, quote unquote, liquidity into the system, it's going to have to come through somewhere, and eventually it's going to wash out into corporates and into stock prices. But that would suggest to me that you're going to get a small number of people who own those stocks, relatively small at least, who do benefit from the huge increases in government borrowing and spending, but large numbers of people who really lose out. Is that a fair read on the disconnect between the two things or not?
I think if you had a really effective support mechanism for ordinary consumers and ordinary families, you'd expect to see it in higher stock prices.
Yeah.
Like you'd expect it to be, you'd expect if consumption was able to be maintained, then these businesses would benefit from that. So it's not like QE or something where there's sort of disproportionate losses in one place. I think the bigger point, actually, to yours and Sam's point, is I can't understand why they're so cheap. I just looked up, Sam, the numbers. So the FTSE 100 is about 6,300 points at the moment, which is way up from its trough of 5,000, but still it was 7,500 before the crisis. So it's recovered a lot of its loss, and I don't really understand why. I mean, I have to say, like, I think I don't know if you've seen the front page of the Telegraph today, but it has this thing from William Hague saying it'd be an absolute disaster if we have to go into a second phase of lockdown. And you've got to do what you've got to do. Like it's just a cost we're going to have to bear, as the public health intervention. And it's completely plausible that we're going to have another round of lockdowns into the autumn. When people move indoors in the autumn, when we normally get flu, right? Think about why it is that we normally get flu. We normally get flu for reasons that would spread the coronavirus too. So I think it feels like people are in a sort of slightly false place. That Imperial paper that sort of began all of the our lockdown period envisaged a sequence of locking down and opening up and locking down and opening up for perhaps 18 months. And in that context, I think a lot of the investment numbers, market numbers, look wildly optimistic.
So yeah, I think so. I think you're right. Probably in my bloodstream is not just the FTSE numbers, Chris, but actually the US, the Dow and the S&P numbers, which are even more striking.
They've had a much more dovish central bank response as well. Yeah. So like the Jerome Powell saying that they're not even going to talk about. No one is talking about raising rates at the moment.
So listen, I'd like to. I'm going to bounce on, and if I might, I'm going to sort of leapfrog Brexit. Let's come back to that. But I just think there's a really interesting conversation in the chat here about David Lammy and about the way in which, particularly on this issue, people choose not to make choices. And I see. Forgive me, Naomi. I'm going to pronounce your name wrong, but I just thought you'd made a really interesting point about, is it Naomi Stuttendorp? I hope I've got that right. Naomi, I don't know whether or not you're happy to come in, but the point that you were raising, if I read it right, is it's not just that the recommendations haven't been enacted, but what the knock-on impact of that indecision has been. Naomi, can I bring you in? I don't know whether you've got a camera there.
Got it.
Hi there.
Hi.
So your point is not just kind of give us a list of things that haven't happened, but try and actually measure the consequences of that.
Yeah. So
what you've got in mind?
Yeah, no, that's okay. So I'm a social worker, I'm a practice educator, and just on a really practical basis, the time that I'm having to spend supporting, and also I'm Jewish, so it happens to me too sometimes, but we're okay right now. The amount of time that I have to spend at the moment, and thinking back over 20 years, have had to spend in training, supporting people when they come face to face with structural racism, whether they are young people in the care system, whether they are social workers who are training, or even social workers who are experienced but trying to get on to do additional training. After a while, I kind of sat down yesterday, I actually said to someone, I'm going to have to book another supervision session with you, which is another hour of her time and another hour of mine, because she's been wasting time. We've had to waste an hour dealing with an instance of structural racism that needs to get unpicked. And it's just ongoing. And then you think, how many doctors have we just lost? How many healthcare professionals? How many people now traumatized. I mean, I was listening to the talk last night. I was in tears. I just thought, what a waste. I'm sorry, I'm shaking again.
You mean as Nazir was talking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Apart from everything else. Sorry, I need to put my hands. Apart from everything else, the human tragedy,
yeah,
and so on. But also, what a waste of time. What a waste of resources. Why is such a talented man having to do this now?
Yes.
Really crazy. And we can't afford this. And I also look at it and I think, you know, the climate emergency and all the rest of it is not going to be resolved. Yeah, no offense. It's not going to be resolved if for some reason or another, amoral, morally bankrupt, mediocre white people are in charge and black excellence keeps being kicked into the long grass. We're not going to survive. As a planet, we can't afford this. It's my increasingly radical opinion,
yeah.
I think.
No. I think that...
I mean, practically, we've got, what, 10, 15 years, if we're lucky, to resolve this. And we are sending... Look at Marcus Radford, apart from everything else. He's an incredible football player. I don't really follow football. I hadn't really been paying attention. But whatever has been going on in the 22 years of that young man's life, and whatever has happened in terms of who has been training him, they have not just taught him how to play football. They've taught him how to think, how to analyze the situation, how to reflect on his own life, draw connections with the rest of the world, and speak truth to power in a way that power will listen. This is an incredible achievement. And, you know, he hasn't gone to university. Universities, as you've been talking about a lot, and I work a lot with universities. Universities are kind of having a moment where they might not themselves recover, or they're not going to come back in the same way that they have been. But also we should be looking, what has he had? I mean, apart from everything else, I was just thinking, he's had a professional training, and that professional training has also led to someone who is able to be moral and clear, effective as a communicator. You know, he's not just playing a game with a ball. Something else has gone on here.
Yeah, well, that's so. I think that's certainly right. I think they're certainly feeling that in Downing Street, Naomi. I could see that. Listen. Thank you. I'm gonna press ahead a little, if I might. I'm just going to come back to you, Dave, for a moment on the LAMI recommendations, because I'm interested to know what you think we'll find out if we do try to dissect that list, not just to Naomi's point about the knock-on effects, but just the list itself and the process whereby the government says it will listens, but then doesn't necessarily act.
I mean, I suppose it's a sort of exercise, a quick way of narrowing your focus, isn't it? When, you know, if you go back through the very sort of kinetic activity of the last couple of weeks since George Floyd was killed, you've seen broadly based demands for reform when it comes to systemic racism, and you've seen, you know, very directed attacks on statues, which naturally lead you to a sort of which is the next statue that should come down, and it's not to say that those symbols in towns and cities don't carry tremendous weight, and it isn't a good debate to have, but the systemic racism conversation is so huge that it risks being impossible to get your arms around it. And so I suppose what I'm thinking is, if you go through those 201 recommendations across pretty much every aspect of public life, you'd quickly find 12 that you thought were total outrages and that demanded reform right now. And so I imagine that it's an exercise in narrowing your focus. So whether it comes to deaths in custody and practical things that can be done, or ways of demonstrating transparency and accountability, or whether it's you know, people's opportunities in the workplace, there are things to get a hold of.
You know what I thought was really difficult and awkward last night, Dave, when we were having the conversation with Nazir Afzal, you know, the chief prosecutor. You were there. I think you were there. You're probably thinking.
Yeah.
I really felt uncomfortable. I felt really sad, exactly to Naomi's point. I was really distressed by it, but also I was embarrassed because I realized there were so many shorthands that were being used between people who worked in that world, right? The way in which Ben Toomey spoke to Nazir about, you know, diversions as a different way of dealing with things. And you realized, among other things, that everyone had been talking about the same issues and the same solutions to the same problems for such a long time. So I think Naomi's point is right. You could actually look at the recommendations and then begin to see how long they've been around for and how little has been done.
Yeah. I mean, I covered the Lawrence inquiry, and, you know, again, I mean, it's like 200 some recommendations there, and you know, 20 years on, we've made some progress in terms of, you know, having a police force in London that looks a bit more like the population, but so much still left on the shelf, and you know, it inevitably, you know, not everything has to be about 10 years of austerity, but it's right to say that a lot of gains have been lost through cuts in every bit of public service.
Can we? I tell you what I'd like to do, Dave. I'm going to bring in Yasmin, who's actually often comes to our lunchtimes on Tuesday, and particularly Yasmin, I just see that you flagging up this point, and someone else has too, about the appointment of Munira Mirza and what that means. I'd like to do that, and I'm going to come in a moment to Megan afterwards to try and sort of join the dots more broadly. But Yasmin, can you forgive me? I'm going to ask you a slightly dumb question. Why is it people are so wound up about her appointment?
So at a basic level, she doesn't believe that institutional racism exists. And her brand of racial equality is one that reflects this idea that to be integrated is to be white, to be equal is to not bring, you know, your whole quote unquote authentic self, or not to allow space for genuine pluralism, but actually to say that the norm that we expect is this. To succeed, you have to do this. And that sort of model minority myth is one that race advocates or anti-racism advocates have really pushed back, because it's quite dangerous. Because essentially, and there's the comparable concept is like the Irish used to be discriminated against. And now the Irish are considered white, right? And so there's this process within a society, like say in England, of becoming white, and that's the way to gain acceptance and equality and so on. But actually, that is not the way racial advocates say is the way to do it. The way to do it is to dismantle the white supremacy, or to dismantle the structure that upholds a particular type of group. And she's not interested in dismantling anything.
And do we? And to be, and forgive me, I don't know her, and I don't know her politics around this. How much do we actually know about her in that context, and how much do you think is attributed by the media and social media?
So there are a few clips that have been going around on social media and so on, her actively like addressing these issues and saying, you know, I don't believe that the problem is like if somebody asks you where you're from, or if somebody is complimenting you about how articulate you are, you know, these are nice things. And these are, you know, she's obviously using very small moments to discredit an entire movement of understanding structural inequality. But also, and I mean, this is just me being a bit of a rumorer. You know, her husband's boss is Dominic Cummings. You know, she is someone who has written for a number of years, and there was a piece of hers in The Spectator that also addressed these sort of politics. And to be honest, like the Conservative Party is quite good at bringing particularly a certain caste of Indian to power, because they agree, they have the same politics, right? It's not a progressive politics. It's not a very pro-Muslim politics, I'll tell you that much. It's not a pro-Black politics. It's not a politics that's about, you know, bringing people out of poverty. It's very dangerous for a genuine, just society, and that is very dangerous.
Oh, that is a really interesting point, and one which, yes, I'm going to come back to you about that. I'm going to come back to you about that if I might. Megan, are you there? Just because you in one paragraph managed to link, it seemed to me, all of the issues with in a way that puts me to shame. I do that over about 2,500 words. You seem to manage it in a paragraph, but you landed at a point which was you deal with the response around the murder of George Floyd protests. You come through COVID deaths, and then you begin to raise the questions about unemployment and potentially future waves of the virus or the flu season. So where do you think we're headed in terms of government and confidence in the government?
So I sort of made a point about short-termism in government, and kind of I think you can particularly see it with Brexit, in that we had a referendum and that was a very short-term thing, but we didn't plan for how we would implement either whether if we voted Remain or if we voted Leave. And I think you can particularly see that with David Lammy's comments about, we've had all these reports and inquiries, now we need to implement what they've found. And I think that's something which the government, we come back to time again with the government, is that they have these inquiries and it's very short term, we'll look into it. But when it comes to actually implementing things or making long-term plans, they just don't, it's just not something we're very good at in British politics, I don't think. And I think with Brexit particularly, you can see that because there's all these deadlines that they keep putting in, but then there's never a proper plan of like, well, right, so that's the deadline, how are we going to get there? Or how are we going to plan for that? And then we'll put in the deadline kind of thing. The deadline seems to be the most important part, but actually it's planning that needs to take precedent there. So, and I think you can especially see that with the pandemic. There's just not been a clear route out of the lockdown. Like when Boris Johnson came out on the 10th of May, I think it was, and said, oh, we're changing from stay at home to stay alert. It's like everyone was so confused. I just think that we're not very good at long-term planning, and that's something which needs to change, and something which the pandemic and David Lammy's points and Brexit have all really, thrown into the spotlight. Yeah. We just can't plan.
Or Megan, or anyone else actually with you can help. This is really cheating, but why not? I do an editor's voicemail each week at the end of the week. It's sort of as if I've sort of picked up the phone and left a message to say, here's it's a kind of unloading, here's what's on my mind. And it's not brilliantly structured, I admit, but it's intended to make a point about the cumulative impact of the things that we've heard in Think-Ins and the work we've been doing. I had a conversation this morning with Katie Vanek-Smith, who's my co-founder at Tortoise, and it came out of our 8:30 call where every morning we talk about things. And one of the things that came up was what's happening around children, to the point that David made on the news list, and the anxiety in children. And I'm going to look at it specifically, that point, anxiety in children, on Friday at the Sensemaker live lunchtime Think-In. But Katie made this point that we as in the UK have chosen the language of war, right? That we've been very focused on a wartime narrative, right? And we are going to defeat the virus, this enemy, etc., etc. And it really struck me this, and I was thinking, for all the debate around Churchill and the Churchill statue, the real problem is the Churchill in our mind, the extent to which we try to formulate, project and government around a kind of Churchillian narrative, most of all this Prime Minister. And when we got to the end of it, conversation with Katie, she and I looked at each other on the screen and said, all right, but if it's not a war, right, and it's obviously not a war, what is it, right? It's not a business plan, it's not a budget, it's not and it may just be it's a coronavirus, but I don't know, Megan, whether you've got an answer to when you think about how the government should be thinking in the long term and planning for something different. If they were to move away from the war time and all those martial metaphors, what you would reach for?
I think just sort of recognizing this for what it is, and the fact that it isn't a war, it is something that we've not had to deal with before. It's very different, and actually taking that sort of this new situation that we're in and working out, well, what what works in our government that we can use to deal with it, but what do we need to change and where do we need to move to? I think that I really don't like the war metaphors, because we're not at war at the moment. It's a virus. Like it's completely different. So
Megan, thank you. John Alexander, I sort of waved at you and said, please come in about half an hour ago. Tell us what you make of this, but I think, hello there, how are you? You want to just unmute? There you are. John, can you unmute? Are you unmuted? No, we can't hear you.
You can hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Far away.
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, actually, yeah. I was saying some stuff about shopping at the beginning, but this, in a way, is this challenge of metaphors is a really interesting place to come in. Some of the stuff I'm thinking about and working with a lot at the moment is what the frames that we're thinking about this moment in time through are, sort of one level above, like what specific metaphors, what are the kind of collections of metaphors. And so I talk a lot in my work about subject, consumer and citizen as different stories of the role of the individual in society. And in a way, the war metaphor was very powerful at kind of setting up a subject story, contributing to a frame where, like, the right thing to do is keep your head down, do as you're told, and for government to kind of step in as the great protector and sort of put us in our place and hide us from this enemy. And when the stay-at-home and that was sort of starting to collapse, actually, I would argue, and the stay-at-home to stay alert thing, I argued was a kind of deliberate sort of look over there moment where they were kind of shifting from a subject frame to a consumer frame and going, like, let's put responsibility onto the people because they're starting to realize that we've cocked up. And that moment, and I think that what's interesting about the consumer frame is that we've been stuck in that for so long, and it's interesting that the idea that, like, actually this moment of, like, people go shopping was exactly what Bush did after 9/11, and what spread around the world as a story then, in a moment of recession. And so these things kind of are connected, and so you're kind of going, so like in this moment in time, and when that happened, the US economy was just going into recession, arguably was facing kind of need to structurally redesign, which is some of what you guys have been talking about as well for now, and didn't, sort of partly because there was this artificial stimulus to the economy, a kind of consumption-driven economy that arguably created the conditions for the financial crisis, because it seemed sort of patriotic to consume, to borrow beyond your means. And then that resulted arguably, and Adair Turner's written about this, in some of the conditions for the financial crisis. And so this question of what metaphors we use, I think, actually goes a lot deeper, and the kind of the call I'm interested in really is, like, what if we saw this through the lens of people as citizens capable of and wanting to sort of shape the society we're in, not just choose between the options someone's offered, or not just be protected by a paternalistic state, but sort of who were involved in shaping the response. And like what Taiwan's been doing is very interesting on that front. So I don't know, it's just a sort of an offer into all of these spaces of kind of what story of ourselves are we living in, and are we being told, and are we telling ourselves, and what might we, and what metaphors might come from that are about kind of creating the future together, rather than, anyway.
It's such an interesting one, and while you're talking, both Polly Curtis, my colleague, and Yasmin, who we just heard from, were just making different metaphors. One, which I have to say I love, which is about building and building a building. Not least because we had our AGM of our investors last week, and our investors always say, you're not looking for investors, you're looking for builders, right? And there's something really complicated and meticulous about building a building. But I said also I'd come back to and forgive me, I don't know whether it's Aid or Addy, but either way, will you tell me a Clulo? Can you just talk a little bit about the metaphors point, if you can hear me, and we can pick you up. There you are. Yes, hello. Sorry, is it Aid or is it Addy? Yeah.
No, it's Aid.
Oh, Aid, hello.
So I'm in my kitchen just making some lunch while we're listening and talking.
Yeah.
No, I mean, just from a personal perspective, I suppose, just very slightly off topic, during the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, I was serving throughout those and served in one of those locations. There was a huge outpouring of support for the armed forces, and the government very slowly got on board with that as well, and now armed forces are reasonably well provisioned. Constantly I was thinking about the impact on the NHS and frontline workers who were, I suppose in their own terms, going through something of a crisis. But as one or two speakers have said today, the war metaphor, I think, was overused, and in some ways I think almost was used to try and distract us from the fact that as far as the evidence is concerned, we really as a country haven't done that well in dealing with this pandemic. And whilst it's a very controversial approach, but I do think that risk has not been sufficiently part of our exit strategy from lockdown, and the reintroduction of the various sectors. Because when you look at it, the risk is extraordinarily low for individuals to contract and then die of the disease. And the impact of the decisions that have been made on that extraordinarily low risk have been quite out of proportion. And so I think that's really the point that I wanted to make to the discussion here today.
Abe, thanks. I mean, it's been really interesting, I think, reading what Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, had to say about the failure to acknowledge scientific advice and the dither that accompanied the move into lockdown, i.e. being too slow into lockdown. You can't help but wondering whether there's something similar going on now in terms of understanding the risk and the economic impacts, and not just whether it's been too slow, the return, but the management of the return. And I know that's a hugely debated subject, but it's really interesting. I've got to say I'm very confused, increasingly confused by the relationship between what the government says and the scientific advice on the risk. But thank you for your contribution. I'm going to just bring in my colleague, Polly Curtis, who's a fellow editor here at Tortoise, and when I asked her what it is if it's not a war, you said it's society, and you also messaged me to say you've got to do another thinking in what must be 6 minutes. So it's going to be brilliant, and it'll be brief, Polly. So what do you think?
Well, I don't think we need metaphors. I think it is a society. This needs a societal response. It needs us to all pull together. And the last thing we need is a government that is talking about wars in all of this, because wars are divisive, and you see that happening across the debates that are raging at the moment, this divisiveness, just at a time where we have to pull together. And I think the news on free school meals this morning kind of makes that point. They're suddenly realizing that the populist thing to do is to be a society and to do something that looks after its most vulnerable.
Polly, can I ask you, I know you've got to go to this thing, but nonetheless, I still want to ask you about one other thing. So Dave put on the list, which I think is completely right, this Maria Ressa Rappler case in the Philippines. And she's been one of those people you look to who stood up against the, Duterte control of the press. What do you think? I know the Reuters news report's out today, and it's talking about changes in the way in which we're getting our news information. What do you think about the bigger picture of suppression of critical information in COVID-19? Is there a scene there that we should be exploring, do you think?
I think it's like, well, if we go back to the war metaphor, that's kind of the battleground, isn't it? It's kind of, if we're going to go for metaphors, that there is a huge battle going on for information at the moment. And a lot of it is about undermining credible, trusted sources. And again, having kind of populist direct relationships with voters and audiences. And I think kind of what the Maria Ressa case shows is that we as a journalistic industry needs to pull together and make the case for journalism and the role that journalism has in the world, because unmitigated information on the internet we thought was going to be this amazing democratizing force 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. and it's not been. It's been really subverted by powerful and rich institutions and by politicians. And so I think the case for journalism needs to be made now.
Yeah. Okay, well, listen, I realise I can see you slightly looking at the clock, and I know that feeling of having to make sure you get there on time. So, Polly, thank you very much. I'm gonna come to, thanks so much, Polly. I'm gonna come to Yelena, if I might, who's got her hand up. And then I am just, is there anyone, by the way, who's from New Zealand who's joining us today? If so, I do want to just touch on that New Zealand point that Dave raised. Yelena, there you are.
Hello.
Hello. You had your hand raised with regard to what?
Yeah, I was just chatting about it with Basia in the chat as well. I think it's really interesting. The fact that Boris Johnson has chosen to use such aggressive rhetoric and framing this with respect to a war. I know that he was talking about, coronavirus as a physical assailant, as this invisible mugger that must be wrestled to the floor. Beyond having these sort of Trumpian echoes, I think he needs to be very careful when it comes to using divisive wartime rhetoric if he doesn't want that to come back in kind at the next election. Right. I think one of the first things I thought about when we had the first Prime Minister's questions between him and Starmer was the fact that actually there could be an opportunity from this for a sort of 1945 post-war era sea change. If Boris wants to frame himself as a Churchillian figure, then he should be prepared for the fact that the people might want a more reserved, less ebullient, more Attlee-like perhaps figure to replace him after this situation, depending on how the government deals with it. Having said that, I am also quite sceptical because this is the man who last time was able to be elected despite the fact he was escaping into a fridge. So I don't doubt that he will find some way to evade that, but I do think that using wartime rhetoric and framing it in this way could pave the ways for a sort of post-war era election.
Yeah, it's more that he's haunted by 45, that strangely he spends his time thinking himself as Churchillian only to discover that. I think the problem with all of it is that, the present and the future always turns out to be a little like history, but not a lot, what's that great Mark Twain line? The past doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Where is Chris Cook? I'm just going to come back to you, Chris, because unfortunately we are back deep in the Brexit business, and so please move your left shoulder so we can appreciate your fridge. There it is. But Chris, can you just pick up on a point that was made in the chat, which is, part of the critique in the piece that you did for us last year about Defeated by Brexit was that the civil service started scenario planning for Brexit. Cameron shut it down, and so when the vote was cast in 2016, actually government was wholly unprepared. It seems as though that mistake is repeating itself in a different form now, which is consumed by COVID. We're suddenly rushing for the exit, but it's very unclear what scenario planning is happening, whether Operation Yellowhammer restarts. What's your read on what's going on in Whitehall on Brexit?
I think they've genuinely, the political position is that they genuinely are more sanguine or insouciant about any disruption that will come in January, which I think is wrong. I mean, the one of the most badly affected some of the most badly affected sets of businesses in the UK by the virus are, logistics and supply chain companies who have to plan intensively for any shift in the terms of our trade. I think they fundamentally don't believe in basically conventional analysis of trade and economics. I mean, one of the things that was quite alarming in the Sunday Times this week was they thought it was funny that the Treasury had found it so difficult to forecast how bad the losses were going to turn out over the last few weeks. They kind of they have real contempt for the discipline of economics as an idea, and they're very sanguine about what it means, I think, to have disruption to our terms of trade.
It's an interesting thing too when you think about it, because there are not so many sort of business-minded Tories, funnily enough, in that top team, right? If you look at them, I mean, obviously Rishi Sunak's had some experience in finance, but that's rather different. And I just wondered whether or not you think that we are headed for a sort of showdown, an attempt to get to the end of the year and essentially look each other in the eyes and hope that both sides blink, whether or not there's a possibility of a fudge, always the greatest British policy option, or whether you think more likely than not now, Chris, we end up with no deal.
So I think it's still possible we'll just concede on lots of stuff, like we did to get the original withdrawal agreement through. We just gave up on all of our red lines and accepted we would have a customs border inside our own country, which is worth re-stressing how big a concession we made to get the original withdrawal agreement through. It's also worth noting that, as looks likely, so the new Taoiseach in Ireland is going to be Micheál Martin, who is, if you think Leo Varadkar is, it's not appreciated in the British press, Leo Varadkar is from the least nationalist of the Irish parties. He's by someone who is, I mean, it's a sort of slightly crude thing, but someone who's from a more nationalist party, the more nationalist of the two Irish parties. And they're all, in their programme for government, they're very clear they're going to defend the withdrawal agreement. So the idea there's going to be any give on Ireland, I think the chances are zero of that. We might just concede and they might just try and sell concession, or we might drift out into no deal.
And Chris, just forgive me, one other element of this. I see that sort of that people are starting tweeting this morning about the idea of Boris Johnson merging the.
It's happened. It's been
office. They announced it. So can I just make a point? But sorry, merging the Foreign Office and DFID, the international development. The Foreign Office has wanted to get its hands back on the money that flows through aid, and the people who work in aid and development have been deeply worried about trying to use aid to deliver UK foreign policy objectives. Can you, I don't know, I can't figure it out, but what's the context of this as regards Brexit and Britain's place in the world? What's happening? I
think it's not that. It's like, you have to see it as like, there are things that just some people just believe, right? So there are, like, we should bring back grammar schools, and there are too many people going to university, and we should get rid of the Department for International Trade. Right. Like it's like a right-wing political correctness, and it's unthinking. The reason, like we actually, Britain's quite good at delivering aid, like the Department for International Development have worked. It's also the case that we were involved in some really horrendous scandals, and we've managed to actually, things like Al Yamama, like Britain having to basically stop criminal investigations into one of our large manufacturers because they happen to be bribing people, show that like the capacity for things to go wrong if politics, commerce meet in other jurisdictions are really, really significant. The fundamental thing about, there's loads of people in Whitehall who want it because fundamentally their Foreign Office basically doesn't really matter very much anymore. It used to be that UKREP, the UK representative in Brussels, was really important. You do loads of diplomacy now directly sort of department to department, and on the ground, particularly in in the old, basically ex-colonies, where some of the embassies are really grand because they're the former imperial premises. It's the guy from DFID who's got all the money. So there's sort of, it's trodden on the dignity of the FCO. People who join the FCO think, one thing they really prize is their own dignity.
Well, Chris, thanks. I'm just going to give the last word to Arthur. You're still there. I know we're running right out of time, but you just said that you worked in the Foreign Office, and your view is it's possibly not such a foolish thing. Will you share your view on it? Hello there.
Well, yeah, I think I think that there is an issue of coordination. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily agree with what Chris said about dignity. I think that the difficulty is where you have an uncoordinated approach, and in quite a lot of the scenarios that Chris has described, where you have a huge DFID program, It operates from a separate building in a separate set of leadership, and ultimately it's the British government that looks sort of incapable and unprofessional. Now, there are plenty of countries that are serious aid donors who do it from a single combined ministry, and others who do it from separated ministries. So it doesn't have to be part of a kind of unthinking right-wing agenda, although I agree that this particular decision at the moment probably is that.
Right. Arthur, thank you. This is the very opposite of what we're supposed to be about. We're not supposed to be doing snap judgments on breaking news, but when it's really interesting and it's really consequential, we can't help ourselves. So Arthur, thank you for giving us some context on that. I suspect that there will be people who are deeply concerned about what that means for the allocation of the 0.7% of government commitment to aid and development spending, and how that will be targeted and how it will be measured and what does and doesn't qualify. And it's certainly something for us to follow up. Listen, we've run out of our allotted hour. A huge thank you to everyone who's come. I think it's, we're just beginning to develop a way of trying to open up everything about our journalism, not least the stories and subjects we're looking at. And so I hope that people think that the news list that Dave delivered at the beginning of this hour was really useful. I found it incredibly useful, and it meant that we could pick up on some of the other subjects. I saw Sam mention markets, or Yasmin raised, the appointment of Munira Mirza. It gave us room to talk about those other things, but I hope we actually had a talk about unemployment, thought about Brexit, discussed, and we'll follow up on David Lammy, and you'll see, I think, the follow-up on that proposal that Dave had about following up on Lammy's point about the non-action, the inaction on recommendations. We will come back to this question about the impact on children, so please join us on Friday at lunchtime for that. And I see there's a debate about journalism in this context. I feel we only just sort of brushed past that. That's something we need to discuss further. And thank you also for your help in discussing metaphors and where they've gone wrong and where they could more helpfully and to steal the point about building buildings, more constructively go. So with that, thank you for joining us. It was a really interesting conversation. At 6:30 this evening, we're going to do a very specific look at digital Britain, at the infrastructure of our telecoms systems, and at what next for big business and for the agenda of profit and purpose with Philip Jansen, who is the Chief Executive of BT. Please join us. I hope it'll be an interesting discussion. It kicks off at 6:30. Have a very good afternoon, everyone. All the best.